Hi there. In this online lecture we're going to look at the first step of absorption costing, which is to allocate and apportion indirect costs to the cost centres of the business. I'm Gareth. Well, let's just remind ourselves of what a cost centre is. Cost centres are locations in a business where costs can be gathered together and measured. Now, for the majority of tasks you're going to see in your assessment, that would generally be the different departments within the organisation, and particularly the different departments within the factory itself. Now, there are actually two different types of cost centre to be aware of: production cost centres and service cost centres. And it's really to do with whether the department involved is directly involved in the production of units. Production cost centres, as the name might suggest, are the departments that are directly involved in the production process. They'll be involved in actually making units. A good way to think of them is that these are the departments that physical units of production will actually flow through. So if you're thinking of a car factory, which departments will physical cars flow through? Well, they're presumably going to flow through the assembly department, where they are assembled and welded. They'll presumably flow through the painting department, where they can then be spray painted nice colours. So production cost centres are the ones that the physical units actually flow through. Service cost centres are the ones that physical units do not flow through, as they're not directly involved in the production process. They just exist to serve the other departments. So for instance, a good example might be the canteen in the factory. You can imagine physical cars won't flow through the canteen. That exists to service the employees from the other departments when they have their lunch. Another good example of a service cost centre might be the stores department. If you've got a stores department in your factory, the cars won't go through the stores department. That's just where people go if they need spare parts or if they need to issue some more materials. Now, what we need to do initially is take our indirect costs and break them down between these cost centres. And there's actually two ways we can go about doing that, two key terms you need to be familiar with: allocation of overheads and apportionment of overheads. Now, allocation is where overheads relate to a single cost centre, and so we can directly allocate the overhead to that cost centre. So for instance, if we've got a supervisor in the painting department, well, the salary that we pay that supervisor, that's got nothing to do with the painting department, it got nothing to do rather with the assembly department, got nothing to do with the canteen, got nothing to do with the stores. They are purely working in the painting department, so we could allocate their entire salary to the department they work in. So you could allocate the painting department supervisor salary just to the painting cost centre. Apportionment, though, is where overheads relate to several cost centres, in which case we need to apportion or split up or share out the overhead between the different departments. And what we need to ensure is that we do that on a fair and meaningful basis. So for instance, rent of the factory is a good example of an overhead that might need to be apportioned. You can imagine each department will be in the factory building, so they're all benefiting from that rent cost, so they should all take a share of it. And what we might do is look at the floor space of each department. So if one of the departments takes up 50% of the floor space of the factory, maybe they should take 50% of the cost. If another department takes up 10% of the floor space, well, maybe they should only take 10% of the cost. So allocate is where we're going to send the entire overhead to a single cost centre. Apportionment is where we're going to share an overhead out across several cost centres. Let's have a look at how we might deal with some numbers here. So we're going to look here at allocating and apportioning indirect costs or overheads. And in this example, the company's got three departments: the polishing department, the packaging department, and the canteen. And we've got a variety of overhead costs incurred. So a variety of indirect costs. We've got factory rent of $32,000, salary of the polishing department supervisor, they earn $12,000, some power or electricity charges to run machinery at $8,000, insurance of inventory that they are holding of £5,000, and then canteen food costs of £3,000. And we're then given some additional information about each of the departments. You can see we've got floor space figures for each department, we've got electricity usage figures, and we've got the value of the inventory held. And that information is going to help us to share out some of the relevant overheads. Now what we need to do is we need to allocate and apportion the costs to each of these three departments. Well, let's start by thinking about the factory rent. Well, the first big question is, am I going to allocate it or am I going to apportion it? Do I think rent relates to a single department, a single cost centre, or do I think it relates to several and will therefore need to be shared out? Well, I think with rent, I think each of the three departments will probably be part of the factory building. So I think rent probably needs to be apportioned. I need to share that out because each of the department will benefit from being in the building. If I'm going to apportion the overhead, I then need to decide what basis would be most appropriate. And this is why they give us this other information. So which would be most relevant to apportioning rent? Floor space figures, electricity usage, or the value of inventory? Well, I think it'll be floor space because rent is generally charged on the basis of the square meters or the square feet that you rent, and therefore that might be a good way of splitting the rent charge between the departments. Now we're given the square meter figures for each of the three departments. So how can I use these figures to apportion or to share out the rent cost, which is a total of £32,000? Well, the easiest way to do this is start by adding up the three floor space figures. If I add up 600 meters plus 250 meters plus 150 meters, that's a total of 1,000 square meters. And I can actually use that total to start creating fractions that I'll use to break down the rent. So for instance, if I start with the polishing department, they occupy 600 square meters out of a total of 1,000. That's actually a bit more than half, isn't it? They therefore deserve, I'm guessing, a bit more than half of the cost. Well, the fraction that I can create is if I take the floor space of polishing, divide by the total I just worked out, that's 600 over 1,000. Now, if you actually just do that on your calculator, 600 divided by 1,000 and hit equals, I get a figure of 0.6. That's telling me that the polishing department occupies 60% of the factory space, or just over half, which means that they deserve to get 60% of the 32,000 cost. Well, 0.6 times 32,000 is £19,200 that I think I would apportion to the polishing department. That's their share of the rent cost. Now that's for polishing. What about for the packaging department? Now you can see they occupy less floor space. They're going to therefore get less cost. Well, if I do a similar process of the calculation, if I take the square meters for packaging, divide by the total, and if I start by doing that, 250 over 1,000 is actually 0.25 or quarter of the space. Well, they therefore deserve quarter of the cost. So 0.25 times 32,000. I think I would give the packaging department 8,000 of the rent cost. That's the amount they deserve. And then for the canteen, well, the canteen occupies the smallest floor space. They only occupy 150 square meters out of the total of 1,000. 150 over 1,000 gives me 0.15 or 15% of the space. They therefore deserve 15% of the total cost. And 0.15 times 32,000 is £4,800 that I think I would apportion to the canteen. So I can share out the rent cost by giving each department an amount of overhead related to the space they take up. Now I've just worked through the figures there on the screen. This is shown in a bit of detail lower in the page though. You can see the 19,200 for polishing, 8,000 for packaging, 4,800 for the canteen. And what's always worth doing is add those figures back up, because I know that I was spreading out £32,000. So they should add back to the £32,000. It's worth double checking that it looks like your numbers make sense. And that tells me how much I'm therefore going to give each department. In fact, on the next page, you'll see we've got a table we can now complete where for factory rent, we decided to apportion it based on floor space, total of 32,000, and we then apportioned it 60% to the polishing department, which was 19,200, 25% to the packaging department, which was 8,000, and the remaining 15%, or 4,800, going to the canteen, and we did our double check that those numbers add up. Well, I've hopefully given you a bit of a start on how this is working. So we've got the 4 remaining overheads to deal with. So why don't you go through the process of firstly considering, are you going to allocate or apportion? So if you're going to allocate, you'll just be dropping the entire overhead into a single department. If you're going to apportion, you then need to decide how you're going to apportion it and go through the same kind of calculations that we've just been doing for rent. And ultimately, once you've allocated and apportioned your overheads, you can hopefully identify what the total overhead for each of the cost centres is. So why don't you pause me for 10 or 15 minutes while you have a work through with this one. Well, the next overhead is the salary of the polishing department supervisor. Well, if they work in the polishing department, I'm thinking I would therefore allocate their salary to that department. They don't work in packaging or the canteen, so why would packaging or the canteen want any of their costs? So I think I would allocate their salary because they just relate to one department. I've then got power to run machinery. Now this is an electricity charge, and from the information we were given, it's clear that each department has some machinery because they've all used some of the electricity. They've all used some electricity. So I think that as a first decision, I'm going to apportion the power cost. And the basis on which I'm going to do it is that's kilowatt hours that stands for, which is a measure of electricity usage. And the way we're therefore going to do that, a bit like we did for the floor space figures, if I start by adding up the 3 figures, so 250 plus 150 plus 100, that gives a total of 500 kilowatt hours used. I can then use that to start creating fractions for each department. So for polishing, they've used 250 out of 500. That's actually exactly half. They should therefore get exactly half of the power cost of £8,000. That means I'm going to give them £4,000. So I can apportion £4,000 of the power cost to polishing. They're going to get half of it. I then need to work out how much packaging is going to get. Well, packaging used 150 kilowatt hours out of 500. And if you do on your calculator 150 divided by 500, I get 0.3. So they've used 30% of the electricity, which if I multiply by 8,000 gives me £2,400 worth of the electricity cost going to the packaging department. So I can put that into my table. And then the canteen, they've also got some machinery, presumably some ovens or something. They only, though, used up 100 kilowatt hours out of 500, which on my calculator gives me 0.2 or 20%. So they're going to take 20% of the cost of 8,000, which is £1,600 that I will apportion to the canteen. And when I finish my numbers, just double check if you add up 4,000 plus 2,400 plus 1,600, it does come back to 8,000. So it's worth just double checking that your numbers seem to tally. We've then got insurance of inventory. So this would maybe be the premiums I'm paying to my insurance company, just in case there's a fire and I lose units in the storeroom. Well, it looks to me like each of the 3 departments does have some inventory. So presumably part of the insurance cost will relate to each of them. So I think I'm going to apportion the insurance costs. I want to spread that out. And this will be based on the value of the inventory. So same idea as we did with both the floor space and the electricity usage. If I start by adding up the 3 figures, Well, £12,000 plus £6,000 plus £2,000 is a total of £20,000 worth of inventory. And again, I can use that total to start creating fractions, which will allow me to split the £5,000 insurance cost. So for polishing, well, they have £12,000 worth out of £20,000 worth. So you can see they've got slightly more than half of the inventory. In fact, they've got 60% of the inventory. If I multiply that by £5,000 cost, well, I reckon I'm going to apportion the polishing department £3,000 worth of the insurance costs. So I can put that into my table. I then need to consider packaging. Well, packaging, they've got £6,000 worth of the inventory out of a total of 20,000. Now 6,000 out of 20,000 is 30%, so they'll get 30% of the 5,000 cost, which gives them £1,500 worth. That can apportion into their column. And then to finish off the insurance cost, we've got the canteen. Well, the canteen, they only have 2,000's worth of inventory, maybe supplies of food, I guess, that they'd be keeping in their fridges. Well, 2,000 out of 20% is 10% of the inventory. So they'll get 10% of the £5,000 cost, which gives me £500 that I would apportion to the canteen. And as we did before, if I then add up 3,000 plus 1,500 plus 500, just double check that comes back to 5,000, which it does do. We've then got the canteen food cost. Well, I think the canteen food cost presumably relate to the canteen. So I think I'm going to allocate the canteen food cost of £3,000 just straight to the canteen cost centre. And I can then go through my process of adding up the total overhead that I've now gathered into each department. So polishing will have 19,200 plus 12,000 plus 4,000 plus 3,000, which is a total of £38,200 worth of overhead going to polishing. I've then got the packaging department, so 8,000 plus 2,400 plus 1,500 is £11,900 going to packaging. And then the canteen, I've got 4,800 apportionment of rent, plus 1,600 of power cost, plus 500 for their share of the insurance cost, plus the £3,000 of allocated canteen food costs, gives £9,900 in total. And again, worth a sort of mathematical check of the logic of your numbers. If I now add up the 38,200 that was gathered in the polishing department, plus the 11,900 in packaging, plus the 9,900 in the canteen, does that add up to the total of 60,000? Well, actually, yes, it does. So it's worth doing these little double checks of the sort of sense of the numbers that you've calculated.